reevaluating their bilateral relations with the United States since Donald Trump started his second term at the beginning of the year. A term which has already brought far more change in the superpower's foreign policies than during his previous full 4-year term. Few countries are as connected to the United States economically and commercially as Ireland, and few have more to lose from a deterioration in relations. But that, alas, is what has been happening. Charges of security and defence free riding are growing by the week, perhaps most notably by Robert O'Brien, a former national security advisor to President Trump, who wrote in the pages of the Wall Street Journal a highly critical article of Ireland last month. Issues around US-based companies in Ireland, including where they pay their profit taxes and how they are regulated, are also causing difficulties and could flare up further in the future. The enormous scale of Ireland's bilateral surplus in goods trade with the US is also likely to remain an issue, particularly given that surplus has actually grown this year despite tariffs. Finally, there is the issue of the Occupied Territories Bill. Unprecedented salvoes of criticism have come from American lawmakers on Capitol Hill towards Ireland, with threats of serious economic consequences if the bill is enacted. To discuss the state of Ireland-US relations, it's a pleasure to welcome Tom Wright to the Institute after a period of almost 4 years during which he was at the centre of the Biden administration's foreign policy team. Tom is Irish born and raised, but has been a long-time resident of the United States and Washington, D.C., where he currently serves at the Brookings Institution. Tom, you're very welcome, and thanks for joining us on this Thanksgiving's Eve.
Jan, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be back.
Tom, maybe we could kick off with the security free riding argument. Are we simply too small to matter, or are we, as the Financial Times reported in some depth yesterday, facing growing calls to contribute to the cost of securing our own country and the space in the North Atlantic we inhabit?
Thanks, Dan, and I've got to commend you in arranging the placement of the FT piece yesterday in a lead up to this event. It's very good sort of timing, just joking about that, of course, but I think this question is getting a lot of attention recently, and I just want to zoom back for a second just to place it a little bit into context, because I think it's important to sort of understand that for all countries, but including here in the US, the security environment is rapidly, changing, and we worry about it. In the Biden administration, we worried about new threats to U.S. national security that didn't exist before, particularly on critical infrastructure. So, we had this Chinese operation called Vote Typhoon, which penetrated critical infrastructure, including, electricity grids, water treatment supply plants, and the like, to create vulnerabilities that could be exploited in a crisis, or a conflict. There was a similar operation totally compromising the telecoms systems called Salt Typhoon. We've also seen ransomware attacks. We've worried about undersea cable vulnerabilities, particularly in Northern Europe, in the Baltics, and there was 1 or 2 instances where those were cut, perhaps inadvertently, but we were concerned about that. And just in terms of the US addressing those vulnerabilities, we are behind in doing that. It's going to be very expensive and very difficult, and it's a subject of great sort of, conversation and debate on Capitol Hill, as well as sort of in the executive branch. So all of that is to say that as you read pieces sort of about, Ireland's, role in the undersea cable piece of it, or on technology or on cybersecurity, that is not sort of Ireland being sort of singled out as such. This is something that everybody is effectively, dealing with, at the same time. And I think all countries, a lot of countries anyway, especially here, are quite worried that we are sort of underprepared for that, and fixing that vulnerability is going to be very expensive. So that brings me on sort of to the Ireland case. Ireland is obviously deeply integrated with the global economy, but especially with the EU, and with the US through the technology sector, pharma, which I'm sure we'll get on to in a little bit, on undersea cables and on everything else. And obviously Ireland has not sort of invested heavily in defense or in national security capability. As the FT piece outlined yesterday, there are serious shortcomings in sort of domain awareness in radar and sonar, and just having maritime vessels to have awareness of what's happening in sort of and under territorial waters, including sort of in the air, cybersecurity. I think there are all sorts of areas where there is a huge amount to be done. I think defense expenditure is around 0.25%, which is very, very small. So I would say first and foremost, this is an issue for Ireland, right? Separate to anyone else. It's just all countries need to sort of protect their sovereignty and protect their national interests. And we're at a very, very volatile moment in the international order where the old sort of peace and equilibrium is coming apart. But secondarily, I think it will be an issue bilaterally and also with the EU sort of over in the future, because if we did get confronted with the crisis, given that we're so integrated, obviously you would worry about sort of weak links and vulnerabilities wherever they emerged.
And in terms of, as you look across the sort of the Atlantic, is Ireland seen as being a weaker link, or given their cables from the UK, that ultimately it's maybe not as big a vulnerability as maybe some people feel it is? Clearly, it is for us, but from the US perspective, given its connectivity in different ways,
I would say two things. I think first is I thought the Robert O'Brien piece was way overstated, and I don't hear the type of concerns here in terms of singling out Ireland that he described. That just didn't seem reflective of what I sort of hear. And also, I think I think there is the second thing is that I do think there is a particular issue in terms of vulnerability, because the UK, of course, has more domain awareness. They are a harder target. As I think the FT sort of outlined yesterday, the undersea cables are sort of vulnerable near Ireland because of the density of them, and also because of the depth of the water and the like, that they are sort of vulnerable there. So I don't think it's I'm not I wouldn't sort of say that like Ireland is separate, is first among equals in terms of the focus. I mean, the Trump administration has issues with lots of countries. All countries are deeply anxious about their relations with them. I actually think the Irish government has managed those quite well this year, and has managed to sort of reduce tensions with the administration and craft sort of a way forward. That may not hold. Of course, that can change sort of in an instance. But I do think, that shouldn't lull people into a false sense of security that there isn't a real issue to be addressed. And the primary issue is not US pressure. The primary issue is the global environment. Like, the international environment has shifted. It used to be in the Cold War, the front line was way over there. And now, because of interdependence, and sort of this strategic competition under conditions of interdependence, the front line is everywhere, because it's on critical infrastructure, it's on tax policy, it's on tariffs, it's on technology export controls. And so you see it playing out, and Ireland is deeply immersed in that in a way that I think does create novel sort of vulnerabilities and problems.
In terms of maybe specific things that Ireland could do to improve the relations, it certainly seemed to me earlier in the year that procuring American hardware would be the sort of thing that would give the president a win, announcing this in the White House on St. Patrick's Day. Are you hearing of any pressure from their side to, I don't want to say take advantage of the situation, but simply say, look, you need to arm up, and we want you to buy from us?
Honestly, not really. I think firstly, there's a lot of focus on NATO and the 3.5 plus 1, the 5% sort of number, 3.5 for defense and 1.5 for defense related, infrastructure. So that's been Trump's main focus. He's actually oddly been less focused on the Buy America piece of it, maybe, than he was in his first term, or than President Biden was. Others in the administration have begun to bring that up, but he seems a little bit less sort of interested in that. I think it could help, but I would just say I think the main thing to keep in mind is the need to sort of fix the vulnerability, right? Is to create the capacity, regardless of where it comes from, because I think there may be less of an issue than has been made out with this administration right now, but there's probably more of an issue over the medium to long term, regardless of who is in the White House, right? Because this sort of threat environment is probably not going to ease up, unexpectedly. It's probably going to get worse to some degree. That's going to be driven, also accelerated by, the rise of AI, especially on its intersection with cyber attacks and cyber capabilities. And so, I think, and all of these things take a long time, right? Procurement, sort of training, just getting up to speed, having interoperable systems. So, Ireland can sort of talk to other countries and classify channels to share information about what is happening. All of those things, take time to build. So even starting, today, it won't be ready in 6 to 12 months. It will take, it will be better, but it will take several years.
Shifting towards the trade and economic side of things, Ireland's trade surplus with the United States is gargantuan, and it's largely generated by American companies producing in Ireland for the American market. And it would seem that that is something that, quite understandably, people on both sides of the aisle feel somewhat uncomfortable about, and would not be unhappy to see jobs returning to the United States that are ultimately American companies. That said, the whole trade situation seems to have calmed down since the Europeans agreed in August to not retaliate against the US. Do you get a sense the whole trade issue is settling down, and this concern about surpluses and seeking a so-called better deal from other countries, is that sort of calming down, or do you think that could resurface?
Yeah, I want to get on to the specific pharma issue in a second, but just on that latter part of the question, if it feels like it's settling down, that's almost certainly an illusion, right? Because Trump is sort of addicted to tariffs, and he's not looking, I think, for a long-term settlement where he can say, well, that's sorted out. Now I'm not going to introduce unexpected tariffs. I'm going to become a bit more predictable and stable, right? We saw with USMCA, with the agreement with Canada and Mexico, which he negotiated, right? He then leveled massive tariffs on both Canada and Mexico back in April, and that will be renegotiated, I think, sort of next year in pretty fundamental ways. So he's not someone who's sort of looking for a solution and then sticks to that and says, we found this new, equilibrium that I'm happy with. So I think it could easily come back in many different forms of the EU. I would say on the case, on the Irish sort of case, I think, there is an issue, I think, that's understood by both Democrats and Republicans, and it's largely, there are different interpretations of it, but just to put it out, this, but just in simple sort of terms, you have, like, take pharmaceuticals or medtech, but like pharmaceuticals sort of as an example, you have major companies that the US is the largest customer for them, and they basically pay zero tax in the US and have paid zero tax over a 10-year period because they are able to, register their IP and their patents sort of in Ireland, and then through Ireland through sort of subcontractors, in a way that dramatically reduces their tax sort of bill. Now, the reason for that is almost certainly the 2017 tax code passed by the Trump administration, which created this differential between what is globally taxed and then what is domestically taxed. So the global tax rate is like 50% of the domestic tax rate, and there's other provisions in it that allow these companies to take advantage of sort of the incentives, that sort of Ireland sort of offers, this sort of green jersey provision thing. that Ireland sort of offers. So all of that is to say, that is sort of unsustainable, I think, from the perspective of whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. Like if you have Pfizer paying, sort of $0 in tax in the US, despite the fact that 45% of its products are sold sort of in America, that's not really sustainable. The issue is that really that is a US tax code issue, right? That is something that the United States could fix by changing the tax code. Democrats have advocated for that. They've also advocated for the global minimum tax, which Ireland did come under pressure on in the Biden administration. I would say Ireland was very constructive, I think, and very engaging in that, and actually, got to sort of a solution that sort of worked. Now, Trump has come out against that because he disagrees, and his administration disagrees with the idea of international tax coordination. But that's sort of on the Democratic side of the ledger, right? On the Republican side, on the Trumpian side, they've gone for tariffs to try to level these massive tariffs on pharmaceuticals. They haven't really delivered on that, actually. And I don't know how, they've talked about it, but I think they've sort of lacked focus a little bit. And so Ireland did negotiate this pharma deal, which I think was reasonably favorable. I think it's also fair to say that tariffs is not really sort of an appropriate way in which to deal with that tax issue, right? There are simpler ways to do it, and there's a lot of collateral damage from sort of the tariff approach, including the possibility that those increased costs will just be passed on to US consumers in pharmaceutical prices. But the
Yeah,
same,
because
you can say the same thing about tech and other industries. But I think there is an issue. I would say I do think, listening to Irish ministers and others talk about it, I think they do sort of understand that the windfall from pharma in particular is temporary, right? Like this is probably going to be removed at some point, and they've engaged in it, in reasonable, in good faith and constructively. But if, Washington can't really sort out, what it wants from the tax code or from tariffs, then it's really sort of on, it's on, the responsibility is on sort of America, I would say, rather than Ireland in this case, although there may be some sort of details where it might be a little bit different.
so it seems to me, just summarizing that Ireland has dodged not one but two bullets. So that the deal with the EU didn't include pharmaceuticals, and as a result, Ireland has actually got one of the lowest effective tariff rates into the US among the EU countries, because most of its exports are pharmaceuticals and not being tariffed. So we've dodged that bullet. But also, as you mentioned, the whole tax piece is really about America making the moves that it with its tax code. And again, the big beautiful bill doesn't seem to have reversed the 2017 law, which actually created the loopholes that allowed the companies book so much of their profit abroad. So we seem to have dodged that bullet. So, it seems the administration has not been very effective in putting in place measures that would cause companies to move back, even though that's their stated objective. And I suppose
Yeah,
the
I
follow-up
think
question
that's,
is this successful lobbying on behalf of the companies and industries?
there may be some of that. I do think it's important, though, not to again be complacent that that's going. I know you're not, but like that this is sort of sustainable or will be enduring. And I would just have one final point, which is I think there's an opportunity here as well, sort of on the flip side of it, which is as we're in this more competitive, contested world, and we have this weaponization of interdependence and all of that, a huge emphasis here is and will continue to be on sort of trusted supply chains. Like if you can't do everything nationally, just in America, how do you build an ecosystem on pharmaceuticals, on technology, on other issues where you have trusted supply chains that are resilient to, actions by China or by others like Russia and others. And Ireland is a natural sort of partner in that, because of the close ties to the US and also because of the membership of the EU and close ties to the EU. And so I think there is an opportunity there. So, I think it's not necessarily possible in this administration, but, I think a future Irish government could engage in a real substantive dialogue with a future US administration about how to build a sort of post sort of free trade, economic agenda based on resiliency and integration of industrial bases and technology and supply chains and the like, to try to, ensure that there's, just some resiliency and collective autonomy sort of there built in. And I think Ireland's quite well placed in that conversation.
And I suppose yet another reason why Ireland needs to ramp up its defence, cyber, cable protection to remain trusted, because as others have observed, if those cables were to be cut, the reputational damage for Ireland.
Yeah, and it's not just that, actually. It is that, but it's also, if you think about the tech companies, um, the US can't really afford to have sort of tech companies somewhere where there might be massive vulnerability to Chinese penetration, for example, beyond sort of here. And again, this is not just an issue for Ireland. It's arisen a lot with the Gulf states in terms of AI investments there, particularly with the UAE. I think we had concerns about that in the Biden administration. Trump has sort of reversed those to some degree. And there are plenty of other examples, including Singapore, and others. And so to maintain that deep integration with the US on the tech side will require, I think, a greater degree of, attention to national security vulnerabilities and cybersecurity and the like. And again, these are not just small issues. These are vastly sort of expensive and difficult, but they are about sort of securing that infrastructure.
And staying on tech, the whole regulatory piece, Ireland's in a quite difficult position, obviously, hosting so many of the big tech companies who do a huge amount of business in Europe out of Ireland. Certainly, my understanding is that much more of the corporation tax, comes from the tech sector than the pharmaceutical sector. But on the other hand, there's always been a tension there with the US feeling that they're over-regulated in Europe. And clearly, with this administration, there is that feeling, as well as the sort of culture war issue of free speech and how the tech companies are involved in that. Does Ireland risk getting stuck in the middle here of having a difficulty in regulating these companies up to the levels that its EU partners want, without annoying and bringing difficulties with the United States?
I mean, possibly. I think the larger issue is probably for Ireland is probably with the EU, than with the US, because I think the US sees Ireland probably a bit more as sort of ideologically aligned in terms of, not a perfect phrase, but sort of lighter regulation, or, on the US sort of tech sector than maybe, the French would want or others would want. And, as Ireland sort of moves a bit closer to the EU, that may increase tensions, with the Trump administration in particular, but I suspect they would see the primary, center of gravity of that being elsewhere, not necessarily in Dublin, if you know what I mean. And they sort of do, the tech companies do want to be in Europe, so they need to be somewhere right in the EU. So I'm not sure from sort of a US perspective that sort of Ireland will take the main hit there, but I think it will be difficult. It'll be a difficult tightrope to walk across for sure. And I think the EU is unlikely to capitulate on these things because of US pressure. I do think there's a separate question just from the perspective of EU governments and citizens themselves about how to be competitive and innovative in the world that we're in, and whether or not some of these regulations are a good idea or a bad idea. That's there are plenty of people who might want to change those purely because of EU national interest or interest, rather than because of pressure from America, right? So I think that's, we should sort of let that play out.
As is happening. Let's move on to the issue of the Occupied Territories Bill and the criticism Ireland has faced over that. Maybe this is not as big an issue. I was certainly very concerned. I still am during the summer when these criticisms were being made. But it seems like other countries, Belgium, Spain, have moved in the same direction as Ireland. I'm certainly not picking up any great concern from those capitals about blowback from existing US laws on sanctioning Israel, or with specific measures against those countries. Is this an issue that just may not really, even if Ireland does enact this bill, or do you see trouble down the line coming from this?
Looking at I think firstly, this issue here is regarded sort of in a domestic context rather than in a foreign policy context, right? So there's this movement from a few years ago about the BDS movement, about boycott, divest, in terms of educational institutions. There was a lot of congressional legislation to counteract that. A lot of that could be applied sort of to this case. A lot of politicians sort of are very vocal about it because of sort of just domestic politics and political reasons rather than seeing it as just a purely foreign policy issue. And then even on the Democratic side, where obviously there's huge sort of concern with the Netanyahu sort of administration in Israel, I think there is also, a worry about sort of, a boycott of Israel more generally, or delegitimizing Israel in some way, and there will be a strong, support for, pushing back against that. And I think if this type of bill happened in the Biden administration, I think President Biden would have had a big problem with it too, right? Maybe in a bit of a different way than the Trump administration potentially might, but I think it would have been an issue bigger than, say, his reaction to Ireland's recognition of a Palestinian state, where he said he disagreed, but I think the temperature was reasonably, modest on it. I think there are some specific things to keep in mind, one of which is, the definition of what is an occupied territory, I think varies, in Ireland and in the United States, right? So here, they, people would look at the bill and sort of think it applies, and it does apply to, parts of East Jerusalem, which under every U.S. plan ever offered, for peace in Israel Palestine would be considered to be part of Israel, but obviously under sort of 1967, like PRISM, that falls on the side of, that in the bill, I think would be defined sort of as an occupied territory. And so I think you could expect to see people sort of focusing on sort of the hard cases, as well. And then the final thing I'd say is just a number of senators and others who've come out publicly on this, I think suggests that there is, and I'm not aware of them having come out publicly in advance on Spain or some of the other cases where this has happened. I think to me, this is something that is, is a combustible issue that could sort of blow up domestically, whether you agree with it or not. Like, I think, I think it's just important to be clear-eyed that it definitely has the potential, and the reaction, I think, also has the potential not to be proportionate, right? So it's not that they would look at it and say, well, this only applies to a tiny percentage through goods, so the US will react in some commensurate way for an equivalent amount. There's an entire US infrastructure on sanctions and, coercive economic measures, that can have sort of massive retaliation for beyond sort of the, what the cost might be in a purely sort of financial sense. And I know you had a podcast or an event recently where one of your guests got into details on just existing laws already on the books that could kick in. And so I think that's a risk too. And the final thing I would say is I think, the Trump administration may say, well, look, they've gotten to a deal on Gaza, so, this was threatened during the war because the war was going on. And so why is this coming back? So I think, again, I'd like to think, look, this is a matter for, obviously the Irish government and the Irish people. I'm not, going to say, as someone who recently served in an administration here, like what should or should not be the case. But I think it is important to just keep in mind that there could be quite a strong reaction to it in ways that, are quite significant.
We're out of time. Tom, just one thing. I don't know if you've heard anything about St. Patrick's Day, the normal visit. Any hearing anything as to whether that will go ahead or not?
I would no, but I would assume, I'm sure others on the call may know more. I mean, again, I would assume that it would, because I think, I'm deeply critical of him, obviously, but I think Trump has reasonably favorable feelings toward Ireland, right? I think the thing to keep an eye on, and that's a good thing, I think, from an Irish national interest perspective, right, is just trying to keep things relatively steady at this very volatile moment. I think the thing just to keep in mind is there are lots of different sort of vectors of shock, right, that could come in and disrupt that, or maybe not a lot. There's a handful that could, and so that could change pretty dramatically if he, is aggravated in some way. But right now, I think, again, I think the Irish-U.S. Footing is reasonably stable this year compared to others. But again, that's not necessarily going to endure, right? So it requires continued sort of maintenance. I think it's not a finish line that's been reached.
Great, Tom. Look, many thanks for joining us, and I hope we haven't disrupted your the beginning of your Thanksgiving break. So particularly appreciate of you taking the time to join us. Thanks to all our members. Hope you found it as illuminating as I did. Have a good evening to all.